Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and thanks for watching my Photoshop video training. Today, we're going to show you how to import RAW files. If you don't know, RAW files capture all the data from your camera, and most modern cameras have the option of capturing data in either JPEG or RAW format. JPEG is very compressed, and the camera actually throws away, it could be up to a third of the data that it captured about the scene. It just throws it away, and it compresses it into this very easy to share JPEG. But for most of us doing professional work, we want as much quality as possible, so we want to be working with those RAW files. Now, if you use both Lightroom and Photoshop, I'm going to recommend that you import your RAW files into Lightroom and do the RAW processing in there. Then open it in Photoshop when you're ready to edit. However, Photoshop does have the ability to import RAW photos directly using the tool called Camera Raw. Camera Raw gets updated by Adobe on a regular basis, and it's a free tool. If you buy a new camera and you can't import those RAW files into Photoshop, make sure you seek out the latest version of Camera Raw. You might even need a beta version of the update. So just Google Camera Raw and you should be able to find the link. Let's jump right into Photoshop and open up our first RAW file. This is a picture of me taken by Chelsea, as you might have guessed, in Machu Picchu. And I chose this picture as an example because of the extreme dynamic range. We have really deep shadows here and then just completely bright highlights. And in fact, when you look at the histogram here, you can see the entire histogram is used. Much of the picture is actually overexposed. This is one of those times when shooting RAW is going to show you a huge advantage in the final product over shooting JPEG. What you can do is adjust all these sliders to sort of improve the color temperature and the tint, and these should all be pretty familiar to you if you've used Lightroom before. Now, I want to be able to show a little more detail on the sky here because it's almost completely overexposed. The way I'll usually work with these sliders is to work from the top down. So I'll start with the exposure slider and kind of adjust it, and just until the main subject of the photo looks nice, until there's plenty of contrast in the main subject. And to me, that feels about right, because I actually want this to be really dark. And then the contrast, when I move the contrast slider to the left, what you'll see is the histogram shrinks in towards the middle. And when I move it to the right, the histogram pushes out to the outside. And this is something you adjust to taste. How much you want of the histogram towards the middle, giving you flatter colors, versus towards the right. And I think this picture looks best with plenty of contrast. So I'm going to up that a little bit. Now the highlights address this part right here in the histogram. You can see this addresses the whites and this addresses the highlights. It's kind of showing it there. And I could just grab it here and drag it down. Or I could use the slider here. These are doing the exact same thing, just two different ways to adjust the same setting. So as I drag that down, you can see it adjusts the whole part of the picture, the whole histogram. Look how much more detail I was able to retrieve from the sky. If I'd been shooting a JPEG, all that detail would have been lost, but there's actually a lot. You can see there are nice wispy little clouds up there that were just completely hidden before. The shadow slider, again, I can either grab it here on the histogram, or I can grab the slider right here. This is going to raise the lowest part of the histogram and kind of show me details in my jacket and the bag, the deepest parts of the shadows here. So you just adjust this to taste. And the fact that all of this is nice and smooth is owing to the fact that I'm shooting RAW. You can zoom in deeper here to kind of see just the detail that you're pulling out of the photo. Oops, I screwed that up. I'll zoom into 100%. And as always, hold down the space bar if you want to be able to drag it around with your cursor. So working our way down further, we can adjust the whites and the blacks. As I raise the whites up, I just want part of the picture to be clipped. Now, if I hold down the Alt key, Photoshop is going to tell me exactly the parts of the picture that are overexposed. So if I let go of the Alt key, it'll show me the original picture, and I can see that all of this is so white that there could not be any more detail in it. All this will just look exactly the same. So usually you want a little bit of clipping in the picture, just parts of it to be pure white. And the same applies to the blacks. I could just drag it down and adjust it to taste, or I can hold down the Alt key to see parts that are clipping. And you want something to clip. So there you go. There's a little bit of clipping. That's good. Now we have 3 creative sliders down here: clarity, vibrance, and saturation. The clarity sort of adjusts local contrast. It'll look for areas of contrast and accentuate it a little bit. And so as you can see, look at the peaks and how much more they pop as I drag the clarity slider to the right. If I drag it to the left, they almost blend in to the sky, and it softens everything and gives it kind of an ethereal glow. I hate that. I actually like things to be hyper realistic, if anything, so I'm going to increase the clarity slider just a little bit. If you go too much, it starts to look HDR-ish. But at the same time, you can see it really accentuates the God rays here. So I'm going to raise it up just a little bit. The vibrance is just like saturation, but I'll start with the saturation. If I raise the saturation up all the way, you can see these greens end up looking terrible. If I raise set that back to 0. You can't double click the labels like you can in Lightroom. If I raise the vibrance up all the way, it is much more gentle. As specific colors approach 100%, vibrance handles it a little more intelligently and kind of curves it off smoothly to create more natural effects and to keep some detail in it without completely blowing them out. Let's bring that back to 0, and I'll just adjust it up a little bit more slowly. Because these mountains really were quite blue, the camera just didn't capture it all. So now, after I've made these adjustments, I always revisit it. I go to look at the original picture and I look at my adjustments. And generally what I'll do is I'll back everything off a little bit because you're always at the risk of over-processing things. I actually think I want a little more shadow detail in here. So I'm just going to avoid over-processing, I can see I raised the contrast up a lot. I dropped the highlights a lot. I dropped the blacks a lot. I'm just moving everything towards the middle just a little bit. So it'll just tone it down, and this helps you overcome the natural tendency to over-process. There are a lot of tabs up here, and most of what you'll do will be done in this basic tab, and that I just kind of described all the different features. The tone curve tab, if you are familiar with tone curves, this allows you to adjust them specifically. The highlights and shadows sliders are exactly like on the basic tab here. One difference is that you can adjust the definition of what highlights and shadows are. So here I could say that everything above middle gray is a highlight, and that just changes the way this curve adjusts it. So there might be specific times when you want to do this, but generally it's completely unnecessary. I'm just going to reset these particular items here, set them all back to 0. If you want to be able to add multiple points to the curve, you can do this here. Now you could do this with an adjustment layer in Photoshop later, and we do cover that in the adjustments layer module, but there you're editing not the original raw file necessarily, but some sort of processed version of it. Now, this is not how you should handle points. I'm just doing this for fun, but if you make the point kind of curve against itself there, you can get some really trippy effects. It's just fun. I reset it by selecting linear from the curve here. There are a couple of presets that will just increase the contrast for you, but again, I generally prefer just to use the contrast slider for that. The detail slider allows you to adjust the sharpening and noise reduction. By default, Camera Raw is going to apply a little bit of sharpening and a little bit of noise reduction. You can decide to turn that off completely, which I generally don't do, or you can decide to crank it up a little bit further. The sharpening, of course, can't add more detail to a photo because this isn't CSI. You can't just yell enhance at the screen and have detail appear out of nowhere. But what it does is it looks for areas of detail, areas of contrast in the photo, and it will just crank up the detail a little bit. So as I crank it up all the way to the side, if you look at the edges here, you can see they have more pop to them. But at the same time, if you crank it up too much, let's zoom into 100% here. If you crank it up too much, it starts to look unnatural. It'll also accentuate the noise. So look at all the little points here that are suddenly obvious. If I turn the sharpening off completely, you see this is actually a nice, smooth field. But when I go to sharpen it, it looks at all of that and says, hey, every little difference between any 2 pixels, which is just natural in any picture, any 2 pixels, maybe they should be exactly the same color, but thanks to the way photons strike the sensor, there'll always be a little variance. The Camera Raw tool will see that variance and exaggerate it, because that's what sharpening does, it exaggerates differences between pixels. There are a couple of ways we could reduce that some. You could try adjusting the radius, so that'll actually just look farther and farther for detail, so it can actually increase it. Let's set that back to 1. The detail will try to accentuate the detail even further. It's almost like dragging the amount slider even higher up. So now you can see all this, what used to be a smooth texture and should be a smooth texture is now terrible and exaggerated. Something that can rescue you here is the masking tool. And I'm just going to zoom back all the way out so we can see it. The masking tool will intelligently apply the sharpening just to areas of detail in the picture. So if I slide this up, it's previewing it, but you can't really see it. So if I hold down the Alt key, it will show me just the parts of the picture that are going to be affected. So if I slide it all the way to the left, it's going to sharpen every part of the picture, including stuff that's out of focus and could not be reasonably sharpened. As I slide it to the right, I'm just going to slide it until I see it that it's highlighting just the important parts of the picture, just the parts that I want to apply sharpening to. And, really I can pull it pretty far to the right. There we go. So now, even though the sharpening is way up, it's sharpening my head and my eye and the camera there. But if I zoom in to 100%, we don't see any of that texturing in the mountain that we just saw until you get to the edges. Because here the masking, as you recall, was highlighting it. So it is still applying the sharpening to the edges here, and it looks kind of terrible. I could crank the masking up more. Well, actually, even if I crank it up all the way, it's not going to get rid of it there. You can always apply sharpening after you bring it into Photoshop. Camera Raw isn't your final layer of editing, so you want to err on the side of being more conservative. You might want to recover the highlights more than necessary, because you could always go back and clip the highlights some more, but you can't unsharpen things. So for me, it is a little better to do the sharpening at Camera Raw, but you want to do the bare minimum that will benefit your entire picture. You never want to over sharpen any part of the picture. And for that reason, you might even decide to set the sharpening to 0 and then sharpen selectively different parts of the picture. For now, I think the default of 25 is going to be okay. But again, when in doubt, apply 0 sharpening, because you can always add sharpening later. The noise reduction, let's see if we can find a part of the picture with some noise. This is a pretty clean picture. You know what I'll do? I'm going to increase the exposure of this picture just for the sake of example, so that we can see some of the detail on my jacket here. And this will make the noise more evident. So let's even zoom into 400%. Let's make it really obvious. So now we can see my jacket here. It's nice and smooth. It's not really speckled. That's just the way the camera's capturing it, because it's not getting enough light. And again, the random behavior of those photons means more photons are hitting this pixel right here than happen to hit that pixel right there, even though if I were to gather enough photons, it would average out. It's just not enough light. So we can overcome some of that with the noise reduction tool here. Noise reduction will just look at those pixels and say, hey, for some reason this pixel's way brighter than the pixel right next to it. That's probably not the way it should be. Let's go ahead and even them out. So it actually looks for areas of contrast and reduces that contrast. So as I crank it all the way up, you can see now it really is nice and smooth, and probably more accurately shows what my jacket actually looked like. But at the same time, when we zoom out, you can see we've lost a whole lot of detail. Let's crank that down to 0 so we can look at it. Zoom in a little bit. So look at the seams here on my jacket. As I crank the luminance up, you'll see the detail in those just completely disappear. Now those seams aren't nearly as obvious. That is a trade-off with noise reduction. It ends up looking more natural since the world really doesn't have noise to our eyes, but you start to lose detail. So their default, I think it's 25, and that's a pretty good default. Now, I do want to point out, as I'm adjusting the slider up and down, I have to let go of the slider to preview the results. If you use Lightroom, Lightroom previews it as you slide it, and that is a little thing, because either one will get the job done. But previewing it as I slide it means I can get through the process a little bit quicker. It saves me just a little bit of time, and if you're processing 100 pictures, that can start to add up. So for this particular picture, I might want to raise the noise reduction up a little bit more than the default, just because the noise is so prominent in my jacket with the exposure exaggerated. Not that I would want to keep that. Now, luminance, detail, and contrast, you basically can adjust these to taste, but cranking the detail up will kind of overcome some of the negative effects of the luminance noise reduction, but these values are actually way too high. You usually want to be more towards the center point for luminance detail and probably more down. I rarely go above 35 with the luminance noise reduction, because more than that and it starts to get really blurry. Contrast, as I crank it up, it will start to kind of undo the luminance noise reduction. There's a relationship between these three things where luminance detail and luminance contrast undo the negative effects of luminance. So if you find yourself increasing contrast and detail, usually the right answer is going to be to go back up to the luminance slider and actually just drop it back down. Now, there are two types of noise: luminance and color noise. Luminance is the variation of brightness between any two pixels that in the real world should be the same color. Color noise is the variation in color. Your camera sensor is made up of red, green, and blue photosites, little parts of a pixel basically. And well, there's 2 green pixels, 2 green photosites, 1 red and 1 blue in every section of 4. And then that pattern just repeats over and over again. Now, I told you that photons don't necessarily strike in exactly the same place every time, even when they come from the same part of your subject. They can vary just a little bit. And that means a bunch of photons might hit the red photosite instead of being evenly distributed between the red, blue, and green photosite. If, for example, your subject is white, it'll be sending out some of these. So anyway, the red photosite might end up receiving more than its fair share of photons, and that means for that 1 pixel, it'll be more red than white. So you'll see this kind of variation in color as you really start to peer very, very closely at the image. Well, for the sake of example, I'm going to turn off the color noise reduction. And look at that. So you see this right away. You see lots of yellows, greens, blues, purples. Even though my jacket is black, it should appear gray. It should be reflecting red, blue, and green in the same proportions. So we shouldn't see any variation. And we didn't originally because color noise reduction was doing a lot of magic to make this much smoother. But when you turn it off, you see a huge amount of this. Usually the default setting of 25, I find it just fine for color. I might even be able to lower it a little bit. No, you still see a lot of blotchiness. I see blotches of red, blue, and green here as I crank it up a little bit higher. That's starting to look better, but still parts of my jacket down here look green. Yeah, that's looking better. This could actually be a reflection from the grass. That might genuinely be green. If I crank it up too high, again, we're going to start losing color information that is important. Zoom back out. Okay, so I did actually see some color on the jacket just because there's some flare in the image. So usually I leave this at the default, just my personal taste. And then I will adjust the luminance up as needed to get the appearance of detail that I want. Again, with the color detail and smoothness, as I was saying, smoothness is kind of the opposite of contrast. So you'd raise this up to smooth out the color even more and exaggerate the amount of color noise reduction, whereas detail, you'll raise it up to offset some of the color noise reduction. But again, the defaults for those pretty much make sense. I spent a lot of time describing the noise reduction panel. All I usually do is just drag the luminance slider up until I get where I want it, and then I back it off a little bit so I don't overdo it. In this picture, there's actually some motion blur and such. I don't think the sharpening is going to help it out too much. Let's go back and crank this exposure back down to a reasonable amount. Now the next panel here is HSL and grayscale. And HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. This allows you to adjust all the colors or any individual color. So one useful thing to do here, it's a trick. I can grab the yellows and shift them towards green. And when I do that, the grass starts to look a little healthier. Because grass, when it dies, it starts to become yellow and brown. So yeah, that was an easy fix, right? Just to make this all look a little healthier, perhaps unnaturally healthy. Saturation, you can do the same thing. You could just drop the saturation of all the greens if for some reason you didn't want that, or if you wanted your grass to look super lifeless or super perfect, you could crank it up all the way. Be really gentle with these, because I review a lot of people's pictures, and one of the most common things I say is you crank the saturation too high. And if you do want to make big adjustments to the saturation, that's the kind of thing that you could do after you import the raw file in Photoshop itself, not in Camera Raw. So you could do it later, and you're not going to lose too much detail, really. Luminance is the brightness of each of these different colors. So I could, the blues here. Let's say I want to make all the mountains brighter. I could drag this to the right, and you can see it's not changing the grass at all. It's just changing the mountains as I drag it up. If I drag it all the way down, I could actually make the mountains darker and darker. So this is a matter of taste, but again, you don't need to do the fine tuning in Camera Raw. I actually like it with the blues a little bit lower. But you can. If you want to go black and white, click the convert to grayscale, and now you can make adjustments. Basically, if you're a black and white photographer, you'll understand that there are reasons to adjust these individual channels. We have a couple of videos specifically on making black and white photos, but what it comes down to is adjust those to your taste. Because it's a black and white photo, you've already altered it quite a bit. Knock yourself out. If you feel like cranking the blues all the way up to make that really pop, go for it. Just make your picture look great. I'll switch this back to color before I continue on. The next panel here is split toning. And to understand split toning, you have to understand that sometimes highlights are, in the real world, highlights are a different color from shadows. If the sun is setting, the light that's hitting you is closer to the warm side of the spectrum. It'll be orange and red. We all kind of know that, right? When the sun is setting, we call it the golden hour. You see the sun, it looks really nice and orange, and if there's a white piece of paper, it'll actually look orange to you. However, the light in the shadows is created not by light coming directly from the sun, but light that's reflected off the moisture in the air. And the way water interacts with light, it tends to reflect more of the blue spectrum. That's why the ocean tends to look blue. That's actually why the sky looks blue, because it's reflecting more of that blue. So the shadows get filled with this blue light, whereas the highlights get filled with this warm sunlight. You can simulate that in a picture by separately adjusting the hue and saturation of the highlights and shadows. And again, this is very easily done after you import the picture. So you don't necessarily have to do this in Camera Raw, but you can. So again, I'm used to sliding this and previewing it, but if I adjust the color of the highlights here, well, it's actually not being that obvious. Oh, I need to crank up the saturation, that's why. So I'm, just for the sake of example, I'm going to crank this way up. And that actually made things a little bit yellow, purple. So what I'm looking for is just the point where everything becomes a little bit warmer. Looking for making my skin tones a little bit more orangey. Okay, so maybe it's right around there. I'm just going to bring that back down. And now I'm just going to crank this up all the way. Now I could make the shadows actually cooler by pulling this over towards blue. So that's kind of a cool effect. This also kind of ages the photo. It makes it look a little bit older than it really is, like a print that had been left out for 20 years. So just kind of a cool effect. And that's usually what split toning is. It's a matter of just adding an effect to the picture. Again, this is something I generally prefer to do with the split toning adjustments layer, because that's more easily reversed. You can easily turn it off later. Once I import this into Photoshop, I will not be able to undo that. So instead of doing that, watch the module on adjustment layers, but it works exactly the same. Lens corrections are extremely useful. And what they'll do is kind of straighten the picture out, because all lenses, professional or consumer, distort the scene a little bit. In particular, the corners of wide-angle lenses will get stretched out a little bit. And Camera Raw and Lightroom and Photoshop are all intelligent enough to detect the lens that you're using if you have a common lens and adjust for that. Fix it to make the picture more perfect. Just select that checkbox and it will do it. So you can see it adjusted some matters of the brightness and the distortion around the corner. So just look at the grasses down here in the lower right corner. That's before and that's with it. So you can see it just pushed it out towards the corner just a little bit. This lens doesn't have a lot of distortion. It's a pretty good lens. The vignetting is the darkening of corners. So look at this corner up here and this corner up here before I turn on lens profile correction. As I turn it on, the corners get much brighter. The middle of the picture, not so much. Corners get dark, especially on wide-angle lenses. They just don't gather as much light. It's easily corrected for with this. I will almost always turn on lens profile correction. Sometimes I like the effect of the distortion and the vignetting. It makes the picture look retro, because back in the film days, we didn't have that tool. So it does kind of give it a more authentic and old-timey feel. So I won't always use it. Now, the default setup here will try to detect your camera and lens, and just your lens rather. And if it doesn't, you can manually select it. It doesn't have every single lens in the world ever made. If, for example, I have an old Sigma 16-35 that I just know is not in here, or no, I think maybe it's a 17-35. Anyway, it's not in here. So what I would probably do instead is just pick the Canon lens that was closest to it, and it won't be perfect, but it'll probably be pretty close, because generally any 20mm lens is going to have the same distortion as another 20mm lens. Not exactly the same, but closer than a 100mm lens. You can also manually correct the distortion and vignetting. You can see if I increase this, it's just going to adjust the corners. Just look at the corners and kind of the way it's twisting the picture. The default is usually just fine, but if you find it's not perfect, then you could just adjust it further. If I drag this to the left, you can see the corners get darker or the corners get brighter. So again, if your picture's probably perfect once it adjusts it, but you can adjust those manually. The effects, these are also familiar to Lightroom users, but dehaze will, this is a good picture for that. As I crank it to the right, you'll see it's going to add just so much more contrast, especially in the background parts of the picture. Now, this is operating like a sledgehammer, because I might want to dehaze the background here, but not the foreground, and it's just going to try to dehaze everything. You can see it's drastically changing me. The dehaze tool isn't something that's really all that easy to do in Photoshop. So if you decide you want to dehaze the background, what I would do is I would apply dehaze here, and then I would re-import this same photo without applying dehaze, and I would stack those two images together and blend them, and just take the best of the two pictures. And we'll show you in other modules how to kind of blend pictures together like that. Dehaze is a terribly useful tool. You can also add grain using the Camera Raw tool. There's no reason to do this in Camera Raw, because you can do it in Photoshop later. And grain is something you could not take out, so we're not going to do that. And the same thing with the post-crop vignetting. It's a cool effect, but you can do it in Photoshop. And if you can do it in Photoshop, then you shouldn't do it in Camera Raw, because Camera Raw changes are not reversible. They won't overwrite your RAW file, but you can't later go in and dial them back, whereas changes in Photoshop, if you implement them with layers, you can. So let's get that back to 0. The camera calibration changes the process that you use, and you'll always want to use whatever the latest process is. This camera profile setting here actually is useful, and I find myself always using Adobe Standard, but it just changes your starting point. So depending on your camera, it could have these different profiles built into it, and this was shot with the Canon 5 DSR, and you can see it has a portrait setting that will change the balance of the colors a little bit to provide better skin tones. It has a landscape setting that will probably make the greens pop a little bit more, and yeah, it increases the saturation a little bit. You can play with those and just pick the one that makes your picture look best. But generally for me, I prefer just to work with Adobe Standard and then make adjustments to the saturation and color balance as needed for that specific photo. And you can see you could actually adjust individual red, blue, and green hues and saturations here. If you're an advanced user and you find that your camera isn't putting enough reds in, you could fix it there. We don't have any presets saved, but you could make a preset down here by clicking that little icon and then naming it, and I'll just call it the Machu Picchu preset. Choose which of the settings that you've applied that you actually want to implement into the preset. And now, next time, if I go through and I screw this up a whole bunch, I could return to the preset and just click it, and it will return to all my settings. So if you're not using the presets in Lightroom to apply these types of changes, this is a really useful way to be able to quickly flip through different looks. So if you edit 10 pictures and you save 10 presets, when you go to edit your 11th picture, you could just try clicking on all the different presets and pick the one that is the best starting point for you. And that can really speed up your workflow. So I do encourage you to make some presets. Snapshots are a useful way to kind of roll back changes. So I'll save this as step 1. And then, let's crank the exposure down. I'll save a new snapshot and we'll call it step 2. And then I'll crank the exposure way up. Save a new snapshot as step 3. And so now I could easily switch to each of these different snapshots and save all the settings. So this is almost like a virtual copy in Lightroom, just allowing you to save different versions and easily switch between them. When you're done, you can click Save Image here, or you could just open the image in Photoshop, and that's probably what you're generally going to do. I'll say there are even more tools up here. And again, I don't see the need to use these tools too much because generally you're going to be doing this stuff in post. For example, you could crop the picture here. But why would you? Because it's so easy to crop things in Photoshop. You could remove red eye here, but you can do that in Photoshop. You could remove spots, but you should do that in Photoshop. So the rest of these things you could do here, but are better done in Photoshop. So let's just open the image in Photoshop. So I'd like to close on a couple of points. First, Camera Raw is a free tool from Adobe. You don't need Photoshop to use Camera Raw, so anybody could process the RAW files with Camera Raw. If you buy a new camera and your current version of Camera Raw doesn't open those files, you'll have to download the newest version of Camera Raw. You might even look for a beta version of Camera Raw that supports your camera because Adobe will quickly after the camera is released, they'll have Camera Raw out, sometimes before the camera is even available. I generally encourage people to get Lightroom and use Lightroom instead of using Camera Raw because the controls are better. It helps you organize your photos. However, it does the same job. You can get the same things done in Camera Raw. You can do a lot more in Camera Raw than you should do. You can do things like cropping and red eye reduction and adding vignetting and adding toning, but those things are better done in either Photoshop or Lightroom. If you're using Photoshop, you can do those things with layers. And that means later, a year later, you could reopen your file with those layers and turn off your split toning when the retro look is no longer cool. If you make those adjustments in Camera Raw and you save it, that means you have to go back to your original RAW file and start editing over completely. So basically, doing those changes in Photoshop with layers allows you to walk back in time and selectively undo your edits without undoing everything. Now I'll show you how to view the before and after of your photo, and this can be really important for making sure you don't overdo it. I always like to go back and just make sure that my changes have actually improved things, because sometimes I'll find I went overboard and my original picture actually looked better. There's a little button down here with the Y on it. So you can also hit the Q keyboard shortcut, and it will show you your original picture and your edits. So, as I look at these two, I actually see things I like about the original picture better. It just looks more natural. So this might actually be a case where my edits resulted in over-processing. If I continue to hit the Q button, it will cycle through different states of view. So here you can see it's split down the middle. If I wanted to swap those settings, I could click this button here. And now you can see the before and after are just switched. So hitting Q will alternate between different views. Now we see a top-bottom split, just giving you different ways to see whether you've actually improved your picture or not. That's all there is to before and after. I just wanted to show you where it is. It's a useful way to make sure you don't overdo it. Now let's talk about how to actually save your edits once you make them. Switching back into Photoshop. You can either click Open Image to open it in Photoshop, or you can click Save Image. And if you click Save Image, it's going to, by default, save it to the same folder. And you can select an automated mechanism for naming your files. You pretty much always want to leave the file name exactly the same. You could name it something more descriptive, but by leaving it the same name, it helps you find it and associate it with the original file. So I never change the name. If I wanted to say Tony Machu Picchu, I would do that in the metadata somewhere rather than doing it in here. And that's one of the things that Lightroom is really good at. So I just wanted to show you where this particular format was. The digital negative format is my favorite format to save the raw files in. It will save all the original data, which a TIFF or a PSD won't necessarily. And you can go ahead and use whatever the latest version of Camera Raw here is. The JPEG preview is just a preview that will show up as you're opening the file before it has a chance to render the raw file. So it's not going to impact your final image quality at all. You could choose to use lossy compression, but why would you? Because it is a raw file. It would make the file smaller. Embed original raw file. In this case, the option will save the Canon original CR2 file along with the new DNG file. Adobe's always going to save it as the kind of vendor-neutral DNG file. But the DNG file has all the original information from the Canon raw file. I never see a reason to save the original raw file, so I generally don't. But that's what that option does in case you want to use that. And then things like the color space and the image sizing aren't going to come up as you're saving it as a DNG file. So we can just save that there. And as we look at the original folder that has the file, you'll see this was the file I edited. Now there's a DNG file. I also want to show you that there's now a third file here called an XMP file. And this XMP file, it's a sidecar file. And the XMP file describes all the changes I made in Adobe Camera Raw. That way, Photoshop and Camera Raw do not have to change my raw file. They save this file instead, and then the next time I go to open it, it will look for an XMP file with the same name in the same folder, and if it finds it, it will automatically apply those settings for me. So if you wanted to get rid of your settings, you could just delete the XMP file. And in fact, if you're opening an image, you'll get the option to ignore the XMP file, but that's generally not necessary because you do always have the option to just reset the settings to the default here. Like if you want to just go back in time, you can just click default here and it will reset everything for you. Again, if you just want to open it in Photoshop, just click open image here and it'll open it up for further editing. And that's almost always the next step in my processing. Now I'll show you how to edit multiple raw files at once. This can help speed up your workflow rather than editing one raw file at a time. If you have a bunch of raw files from a set, for example, you took them consecutively and you might want to apply the same changes to all of them, it can save you a whole bunch of time. There are many ways to open the multiple files in Photoshop, but for this time I'm just going to go to File, Open, and pick the folder that has my raw files in it. I'm going to limit this to just showing the DNG files. And then I'm going to click the first and shift click the last. That selects everything in between and click open. Photoshop will see I'm opening up a raw file, and instead of opening it directly in Photoshop, it will launch Camera Raw. And then when I'm done, it will go into Photoshop. So what you see here are a series of raw files. Now, as you can see, I could select one of these and make any adjustments necessary. And then when I'm done, I could open all of these up in Photoshop. Something even more powerful than that, I can select all these files, once again by clicking the first and shift clicking the last. And now I can make changes to all of them all at once. And these pictures were all taken at different times. But if you were at a wedding and you shot 20 pictures of the bride and groom and they were all a stop underexposed, you would select them all and then just drag the exposure slider up. And that same setting would be applied to all of them. You can see it brightened everything up automatically for me. So that becomes a really powerful tool. And I know I've said this before, but if you're doing this a lot, you should probably be using Adobe Lightroom because it has that same capability, but they tend to be a little more powerful. So now that I've made whatever adjustments I need to all the pictures, I could just click Open Images and it will open them in Photoshop. But for now, I actually don't want to save those changes. So I'm going to go ahead and click Cancel. Thanks so much for watching my video tutorial, and I hope you'll check out the other videos in the series where I go into more detail about things like adjusting the exposure and split toning.